At this time, I would like to introduce Mark Pickrell and Kevin Hicks, and take it away. I'll let Mark introduce Kevin, and thank you guys for being here.
Great. So Kevin Hicks is an agronomist with Earthworks Carbon-Based Fertilizers. He's based out of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Both, all one and the same. Kevin and I became acquainted back in 2017 when we started Wilbur Ellis here in Denver as a turf and ornamental distribution outfit. Earthworks was one of the companies that we represent. Kevin and I became quick pals, and Kevin has become a mentor to me, like he has so many agronomists in our industry, from lawn care to tree care to golf. Kevin got his degree, if I remember correctly, from Penn State University, and good sign placement right there, and has worked on golf courses throughout the Western United States. And that's what makes Kevin such a valuable resource to our industry. Is he's worked in the desert, he's worked in the rainforest, and everywhere in between. So
and Denver,
yeah, which is crazy. So what this all spurned from our conversations that we've had many afternoons and evenings over food and drinks and things like that. And we'll dig in today on how unique the soil system is here on the Front Range, how it differs, how to make adjustments, so on and so forth. I think everybody here's got a soil sample back at some point and looked at it, and it didn't look that bad, but yet the turf didn't agree with what the soil sample said. So we're going to demystify a lot of that today. And we got one of the premier soil agronomists in the country to help us with that. So Kevin, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. That was highly overstated, but hopefully we'll talk about a few things. So this is normally a 4-hour class. So if you feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, that's why. But just know that if you've got questions, Mark's got the chat open. He can certainly interject at any point in time. I'd rather it come up right away so we don't get too far ahead. But also at the end, you'll have all my contact info. If you ever get a soil test that you're really stumped on, by all means, give me a call. I mean, what's Mark's is mine and vice versa. We work off of each other quite a bit. So even competitors' labs and other formats, I can take a decent stab at and look at. But I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go from there. So like Dot and Mark said, we're just going to kind of do an overview of some soil testing today and keep it real 30,000 foot view. But there's a lot to this, and I learn something new pretty much every day, even with what I'm doing. And every area of the country is a little bit different. If you looked at my territory, I cover from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and left. So you can imagine the variations in soil conditions that I see and moisture and all those things. I was just in the Scottsdale market last week, and they've got a very unique set of challenges there as well. So I certainly haven't seen everything, but I've seen a lot of the Western US, and some of the conditions are pretty, like Mark said, pretty unique. So let's get into this. And like I said, feel free to write a question in the chat. At the end, we'll try to leave some space, some time, so that we can do some open Q&A, kind of like we did before we got started here. So if you write something down and don't get to it till the end, we'll try to leave some time for you to ask those questions. And I'm certainly happy to stick around afterward if somebody's got something they want to get more in depth with. So feel free to hold on to that. And hopefully we can start to advance our slides. So Earthworks, why do we do what we do? Really, it's two different stories. For the golf course side of things, we do it to make the superintendent's job easier. And for all of you, it's really a paradigm shift in lawn care and tree care and things like that from a model that's been around basically since the year I was born in 1968 till now. It hasn't changed a whole lot. The ChemLawn model has been pretty similar throughout the last 50 years. And we definitely come at it from a little bit different angle. So we'll get into that in a little more detail. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is build a healthier soil system so that not only do our inputs work better, but our turf is healthier, we're using less water, and overall, in the case of lawn care companies, overall, you've got happier customers. There's certainly been a much more accepting ear of customers these days as far as getting into organics. We have a number of organic OMRI certified products, but we also have some bridge products that we'll talk a little bit about. But when we get into the soil testing piece first, it doesn't really matter what the inputs are. We just, we've got some certain goals in mind with trying to balance soils. So we'll get into that here. This is on the right side of the screen is Joel Simmons, the owner of the company. His business partner, Jerry Brunetti, who was really not to take away from Joel, but really the brains behind the operation. And he passed away several years ago, and we're still finding out some of the secret little intricacies of the products that they put together and why he did what he did. And we're still kind of peeling layers off the onion as to the brilliance of some of the things that he included in what we were trying to do. But the company started in '88, and it was not an easy venture at the beginning, but it's definitely gained a lot of traction. Kind of like Mark said, I was a golf course superintendent for 25 years. I grew up in Minnesota, actually went to University of Minnesota as well as Penn State, but spent time in Colorado, Arizona, a couple stops in Idaho. But I was also a long time subscriber to kind of what I'm trying to teach now, and been a customer of Earthworks for a long time. So it was a natural fit for me. I'm going to try to minimize, Mark. I'm going to try to minimize my image up here. Not because I don't like looking at myself, which I don't, but I can't see the whole screen. So why should we be soil testing? And it's a really valid question, because in a lot of cases, we don't see a lot of movement. But I think until you know what you're starting with, it's pretty hard to make an informed decision about the inputs that we choose. I understand that all of us in lawn care are focused on many different things, including weed control, including fertility inputs, certainly profitability and margins, fuel costs, employees, all those things. But we'd love to take some of the pressure off of you and try to help with building a really simple program that works. One of the things that we talk a lot about, it's a terrible business model on the part of Earthworks, but typically when you get into building soils and balancing soils and building carbon reserves in the system, you end up using fewer inputs, which like my boss Joel will say, it's a really bad business model for us. But we really strive to make your jobs easier. And the hurdle that we find is tough to get over is kind of that starting point. And so we'll get into that. Logan Labs is our partner in soil testing and water testing. These are the three formats. Geez, I guess my mouse is going to be a little bit jumpy today. So these are the three formats that we use. On the left is a paste, what we call a water-soluble paste extract. We'll get into all of these in a little more detail. The center is a water analysis. If you've got a big property management contract, or in the case of a golf course, if you've got a couple of water supplies, we love to look at those in detail to see what's going to happen as a result of the irrigation. In the Western US, if you don't have irrigation water, you're not going to have turf. You're not going to have landscape materials. It's just the way it is in this part of the world. And especially in lighter soils, what's going on in your water a lot of times can mirror very quickly what's going on in the soil. So we love to look at those two side by side. And then the starting point for us is the standard soil test on the right-hand side. And that's what I want to spend the most amount of time with today, because I think for most of us in this part of the industry, we can glean as much information as is necessary. And I'll tell you why sometimes we want to look at some of the other tests. But the standard soil report gives us a lot of great base information that we can base decisions on. And this old doc who needs a shave, he's a great picture for me to remind me of, if you walk into a doctor's office, if he just pulls out his prescription pad and starts writing a prescription for you, you're not likely to stick around. If he hasn't done any background work and really looked into what's going on, and maybe done some blood work and certainly taken your vitals and things like that, that's how I liken soil testing to what we're doing in managing turf or managing ornamentals for that matter. So I really say it's like our soils blood work. This gets really basic for most of us, hopefully, but it's a question that I get a lot. And so I always put this slide in here to make sure that everybody kind of understands what we're looking for and how to actually pull a soil sample. Unless we've got a specific problem in a soil, I love to look at a composite sample. In other words, let's use a football field. If you've got a 2.5 acre football field as an example that you're managing, we could look between the hash marks and maybe we want to pull a sample out of that, but I would rather have a composite of the whole field and kind of take an average of that. Typically, and by the lab standards, their mathematics all goes off of a 6-inch sampling depth, and that came out of agriculture years ago. There's cases, certainly in the Western U.S., where you wouldn't have a chance of getting a probe in the ground 6 inches. My only point, and I'll show you Mark's worksheet here just in the next slide, but my only point is make sure that you note what the sample depth is. If the first one you take is you can only get 4 inches in the ground, just try to keep it consistent. Otherwise, the mathematics might be off, and you won't get good data out of it. Leave the grass plug on. The only exception to that is our Canadian customers can't ship that across international lines. But there's a lot to be said for what's going on in that top sample, whether it's organic matter, whether it's nutrients being tied up in the thatch. I like to look at that as a total picture. And then it may not show up. Mark, can you see my mouse on the screen? Okay, so there's a line on most sample bags. Doesn't matter whose it is, but ours has a line just above the address name lines below. We like to see that filled up to that point so that if we need to run, if something comes back a little wonky from the lab, or we need to run a separate paste extract test, there's enough soil there so we don't have to have you send another one. Typically, we don't need that much, but we'd love to see that line in case there's something that we want to look at a second time. Just a side note, the lab will keep all of their soil samples for about 30 days. So if you get with Mark on a sample that you pulled and you say, man, that doesn't seem right for what I'm seeing in the field, he calls me, I can call the lab and we can get another one run out of that same sample as long as it's within about a month. And then they do discard those after about 30 days. Fill the bag to the line. Got plenty of stories about using not clean soil probes or shovels. You know, if you just shoveled out the dog's kennel and then you use the same shovel to pull the samples, we're talking parts per million on a lot of things, and we could pick up parts per million of things that we don't want to pick up. So just make sure whatever the utensil is that you're using, whether it's your pocket knife or a soil probe, make sure it's clean. I've got lots of those stories where you get something back and again, it just isn't right. We know it isn't right, and it's because of how we sampled it. This is a copy of Mark's sample sheet. Couple things to note. Here about the middle of the page is where we put our sample depth. And again, this isn't a graded thing. If you've got a really tough soil that you can only get 3 inches, I'm not grading you down. We just need to know this for the math. All the contact information is really critical for us to get. This section is more for the lab's information, but then they know where to send the results. So it'll go back to Mark. Sample ID, I don't have a preference what you call it, as long as you know how to identify it. If you send in one sample, identify it as you know, Joe's lawn, whatever it might be. And then next to that, we've got boxes that you can check different samples that you want. Like I said earlier, typically we want to look at a standard soil test first. If you and Mark get together or you talk to me about it and we want to look at something deeper, we can certainly do that as well. And this is the lab in Ohio that the samples will go back to. More often than not, unless there's holidays or freight delays, it's normally about a week to 8-day turnaround on samples. Typically within a week, we'll get them back once they receive them. So pretty quick turnaround typically. So standard soil tests, and Mark, I guess you got to give me one of these if somebody throws in a question, because I think you're muted and I'm usually a lot faster than I need to be. Standard soil tests, this is, like I said, this is kind of the cornerstone of what we like to look at. It really establishes a baseline for a lot of things. Most importantly, and I'll drill down here in the next slide or two, most importantly is this base saturation. And there's a lot of information to be gleaned here, but what we're looking for is balancing that chemistry so that our soils function more properly. I know there's a lot of very, very arid soils and a lot of high calcium soils in your area of the country. And that's what we want to really focus on today, but there's a lot of information here. These are some of the things that I look at first. Base saturation is number one. I look at organic matter. That's somewhat subjective, because if you've inherited a lawn care contract that has 4 inches of thatch, that number is going to be off quite a bit. Conversely, if you've got somebody that maybe amended the soil with a good compost, your organic matter is going to show up that way too. And it's indiscriminate how those numbers come back. So I can make some assumptions, but I value input on that because they both look the same on the page, and it may be more often than not, it's a property I've never seen personally. pH, I should put this at number 6 because it's typically the last thing I look at, and I'll get into why. Phosphorus and sulfur is kind of up near the top here on this sample page, and then also the pounds per acre, which gives us kind of our roadmap as to what some of our corrective measures may be. And in the case of a lot of Colorado soils, I'll kind of dispel this notion of every soil can be balanced, because there are some exceptions, and unfortunately where all of you are is one of those exceptions. But we can certainly make decisions based on these. Little interjection, our website, and you'll have access to that at the end, our website has guideline sheets for all 3 of these soil tests that are downloadable. If you want to look at those or keep them in a folder, you're more than welcome to take anything off the website. There's lots of really good information in there, and it can definitely help you. But like I said, you're free to call me anytime you want. This is what I really wanted to get into, and this is one of the samples that Mark and I walked through last year. And it's funny, we started to build a bit of a database with some of his clients, and there were some similarities that appeared really quickly. And what we call a lot of the soils in your area, not all of them, but a lot of them are what's called calcareous. And how that comes about is based on this base saturation. You can see that if we want 60 to 70% on this first line of calcium, this works a lot better on a 8x8 projector screen than it does here, especially for eyes that are getting a little bit older like mine. But 80% is well beyond. So what that tells me is that soil colloid is dominated by calcium. It's inherent in the parent material. It's nothing anybody did. It's the fact that part of the country has been very arid for a long time. There hasn't been a lot of mechanical weathering, and it is what it is. What it does is it drives a lot of other things on this soil test and on the soil that we can't do a whole lot about. Namely, this third one, calcium is driving the pH in this case. If you look up a couple lines down from the top, and this is very common, a very common range for us in the Front Range, is the pH of 8. Now, a lot of people, universities, a lot of consultants will say, well, we need to pound the soil with sulfur to get the pH down. Guess what? You'll run out of money before you've made a whole lot of change in this case. Now, we can make a change in the root zone, but in general, you're talking about a soil at 6 inches that's estimated at about 2 million pounds per acre. So think about trying to move that size ship around. like I said, you're going to run out of money before you ever get any significant long-term change there. But we can react to that. Likewise, gypsum is something that's prescribed a lot in our region, in your region of the country, and it's not wrong to think about gypsum, but it's the why behind gypsum that I think is really important. If we've got a situation where you've got a lot of sodium, typically we look on this test if it's it, and I'll tell you why this is not as important on this one, but sodium over 50 pounds per acre is kind of a red flag for me. Now, in this case, our exchange capacity, which I'll explain in a minute, is so high that this really isn't that alarming. And you can see that in our base saturation down here, where less than 1% of this total is sodium. And so that's not a cause for alarm for me in this case. What this means, though, is we have to make decisions. I'm sure all of you have used things like 2100 or sulfur-based fertility of some sort or another and seen a very good result. The reason for that is ammoniacal nitrogen, ammonium sulfate, calcium, not calcium sulfate, but what's another one? Even urea in some cases, but ammonium sulfate specifically will react with that calcium that's on the soil and actually create gypsum. Between the ammoniacal nitrogen and the sulfur that's in that product, it's reacting. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. So once that reaction happens, you've created gypsum, but you're also solubilizing some of the calcium and making that available not only to the plant, but for movement through the soil, either through irrigation or the odd rainfall that you may or may not have on a given day. So I will typically look at gypsum in this case more as a solution to maybe moving some sodium through the system, but not specifically to move pH of the soil. It won't work. It will, you'll exhaust your expenses, your revenue before you've ever made a change in the soil. Exchange capacity. I think my next slide gets into this, or next couple. Exchange capacities are, again, just a number. That's up here at the top, total exchange capacity. This number is very, very high in relation to most soils at 33. And that's a calculation of milliequivalents per liter. But that number is really high. Typically, that would tell me that's probably a clay type soil. In this case, I'll bet it isn't, because of the amount of calcium that's in this soil. That completely throws off the instrumentation in the lab, which is why that number is artificially high. I would bet that this is probably a soil somewhere in the 10 to 15 milliequivalent range, but because the instrumentation was thrown off by the calcium load, that's a tough number for us to really make heads or tails out of in this case. Phosphorus is one that I look at. I get a lot of questions on phosphorus because there's a number of differing opinions in the industry as far as what the right number is. Our lab typically recommends between 200 and 250 pounds per acre. I probably wouldn't make a recommendation here much past a maintenance type of input at 186. But here's the problem with that. At a pH of 8, availability of things like phosphorus and iron and some of the other minors can become very limited. So to have that in our fertility program is pretty important. And there's sources that will persist a lot longer than others. And that's something we'll talk about here in a little bit. Yeah, we'll jump here. Calcium to magnesium ratio. Again, in calcareous soils, this is a tough conversation to have, but in most soils, if we can get a calcium to magnesium ratio balanced, in other words, this first column that you see on this sample is what we would call an ideal. There is no ideal soil. I've had a few customers try to strive for the ideal numbers, and exhausted, they show up about a year later saying, I couldn't really do much with it. But But if we have 68% calcium, about 12 to 15% magnesium, 5% potassium, this soil is going to function pretty well. There's a lot of variation in there. I look at this third column, that one's going to perform very well. This one on the right, interestingly, if you just focused on pH at 6.3, you'd say, gosh, I'm good to go. But he's got more magnesium in his soil than calcium. In this case, if this were an open agricultural field, if you walked 100 yards across that field and you start out at 6 feet tall, you'd probably be 7 feet tall, because the soil would be so sticky and so heavy because of that imbalance that it would have built up on your boots, and you'd be a lot taller on the other side of the field. So what we would do in that case, regardless of the pH, is we would recommend a number of lime applications. We're quite short on lime in this case. But lime and gypsum work differently. If you ever get a recommendation of lime, you probably won't in most cases where you are, but it's more of I liken it to a 401k type of investment. That's a long-term soil investment. Gypsum is kind of what's in your wallet today, and it can make some changes in the soils pretty quickly, but it's not gonna build or change soil chemistry a whole lot, if that makes any sense. So I kind of wanted to cover a little bit of that. Now, there's a lot of different soil testing labs out there, and the only warning or caution I'll give you is if you get a sample back from a lab that has what they call base saturation and it doesn't equal 100%, it's not a true base saturation. And that was a real epiphany moment for me, sitting in a basement classroom in Kansas City about 28 years ago, listening to an instructor walk through these tests with us. And I looked at my assistant at the time, who was with me on that educational excursion, and I said, it can only be 100%. And he looked at me and goes, I didn't know you were that dumb. I thought you'd figure that out a long time ago. But the point being, number one, make sure that your lab is expressing that correctly. But number two, if we make an input that, let's say, takes some of that calcium off the soil, something else has got to come up, because it has to equal 100%. So in the case of excessive calcium, if we can start working on some of those other things like magnesium or potassium in some cases, that calcium will start to level out a little bit. Even if just in the root zone, we're making headway. So that's where some of those recommendations will come from. This is a sample from Northern California that I pulled a couple of years ago, and I've got another one on my desk here. But this was a case. Typically, again, this was not a normal soil in Northern California, but he had about 40% magnesium and about 40% calcium. Again, if we were at 65% calcium and 15% magnesium, that's about where we want to be for good soil chemistry balance. That ribbon that I squeezed out of that heavier soil turned to rock in about an hour, and would be incredibly difficult to re-wet, certainly incredibly hard to work if you were aerifying or doing something like that. So what we recommended, even though his soil pH was, I think it was 7.8, I said, we got to get some lime on this and get this into balance. We have to build that retirement account, if you will. Once we did that soil worked beautifully. It was a nice loamy soil, but because it was chemically imbalanced, it didn't work properly. And we got him to where he could actually irrigate deeply and frequently and get things working in his favor. The way I like to put it is, I'll ask the question, do you want to work for your soil, or do you want your soil working for you? And once we can get that balance, that gets us in a lot better situation. This is another Northern California soil. Again, looking at the base saturation balance between calcium and magnesium, I would recommend a little bit of high cal lime in this case. But the other thing that's working against him is he's got a lot of sodium. And this is another relationship that I want you to pay attention to when you get samples back, because potassium should always be greater than sodium. especially on a base saturation test. Because once that, if you look at where that red arrow is, we've got almost 11% sodium and just about 7% potassium. Turf grass or plants in general they cannot recognize the difference between a potassium molecule and a sodium molecule. So it will take up whatever is in excess of the other, which can lead to real problems. And in arid climates like Colorado, where we don't get a lot of natural rainfall and flushing, and in a lot of cases we've got very poor water quality, this could be a real problem. This could be, and is in the desert Southwest, is the #1 limiting factor for most turf managers, whether it's lawn care specialists or golf course superintendents. This is probably the #1, because as we evaporate water off of that soil, it only serves to concentrate that sodium or that salt level. So we want to pay very close attention to that. And there's definitely ways to work off of that. If you've got a bad water quality, Mark and I have dealt with one, Fort Collins, I think. Anyway, there's one that we dealt with that's really poor water quality, and it's reflected very, very closely in the soil conditions. So we're trying to make some corrective measures in that case. So again, we're working the soil as much as we are the plant, and that's an investment that can be a difficult hurdle to get over for anybody.
Hey,
I mentioned this earlier. What's driving the pH? A lot of times, I'll be having a conversation with somebody, and they'll say, "Well, my pH is 6.3. I'm in great shape." This is that last column, but right away I can see that imbalance is between calcium and magnesium. So once you know how to pick these apart a little bit, you can see that there's a lot more to pH than just that number. And I'll show you in the next slide why pH is important. It's not that it's not important. It's just in a lot of cases, like in Colorado soils, there's not a whole heck of a lot we're going to do to change that. But we can do some things that will definitely affect the turf health in a positive manner. Hopefully that makes sense. This is a scale, if you've ever taken any soils classes, this is a scale that should look pretty familiar to everybody. But this is why pH is important. I call it an effect, not a cause. And it has an effect on nutrient availability. I mentioned earlier that at pH of 8, where my cursor is, now look at the availability of iron. Look at the availability declining in phosphorus. When you get to a pH of 8.5, which I see a lot in the Western US, that's a pretty limited availability of that particular nutrient. And I don't have to tell anybody how important phosphorus is to plant health, especially in establishment, in seeding, certainly in spring and fall when we're trying to recover from summer stress. But look at all the minors as you go higher on the pH scale, the availability starts to diminish pretty significantly. So that's something that we want to pay attention to. And typically, I know Mark will talk about this with you in your planning. Typically what this means for us, because we can't necessarily move this pH a whole lot, we need to be able to supply that on a fairly regular basis. Iron is certainly one that we all lean on. I would caution you from overusing that, because that can affect availability of other nutrients, and that's probably hour 3 of the 4-hour class. But I guess suffice it to say, if we've got a higher pH over 7.5, which most of you will, we need to consider some of the minor nutrients in our fertility programs.
Hey, Kevin, you hear me, bud?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I had a quick question come in if you have a second.
You bet.
So Mr. Mike asked, what role does hydrogen play in soils?
And
good catch. The rate range on the last samples was anywhere from 0 to 27%.
Great question. Great question. So this one here has an exchangeable hydrogen of 10.5%. Okay, you can't see me doing it. I could cover the pH and tell you that the pH was 6.3 based on that number, because if you look up the definition of pH, it's the concentration or lack of hydrogen ions in the soil. or in whatever's being measured, whether it's water or soil or what have you. In any soil that has a pH over 7, you will have 0% hydrogen, without exception. There will never be any hydrogen showing up on a soil test. Now, if you have a pH of 6.3, I can tell you it's going to be 10.5. I've seen pHs in a couple of areas in my territory. You know, the Pacific Northwest on the wet side of the mountains, up into British Columbia. You know, I've seen 4.8s, 4.7s. They're going to be in the neighborhood of 25% hydrogen. There's nothing we can do to add hydrogen, and it's really an effect of the pH. Does that make sense? That's a good question, though. Good catch. That's next level stuff right there. Quickly, exchange capacity. Again, that's just a number. That's a measurement in the lab. But what that can tell us, in most cases, it tells us the holding capacity of the soil. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got a high calcareous soil, like we do a lot in the Western US, that number may be skewed a little bit, and we have to take that with a grain of salt. My boss was a soils instructor at Rutgers for about 10 years, and he couldn't figure out how to get the concept of exchange capacity across to his students until he was out one night with them drinking a couple of cervezas. And he realized that this was probably the easiest picture for them to really kind of dive into what exactly exchange capacity is. So on a sandy soil, like a golf course putting green, or maybe a sports turf field, you're going to have a very small bottle in which to hold nutrients, hold minerals. But on a real heavy soil, that may be a pretty good sized bottle. So it only has to do with holding capacity. So that's kind of the picture version of that. In a sand-based soil, I don't know if any of you are dealing with sports turf. There's a lot of lighter, what we call lighter soils. Those will have exchange capacities typically below about 8 is our threshold number. If we're below 8, we know we've got a very light sandy soil, and there's some things that we need to account for, primarily on a standard soil. And this is where we get a lot of blowback from university types is that, you know, this base saturation thing, it doesn't work. Well, that's correct in the case of low exchange capacity soils. I can't see this number because my picture's up again. Is that 2 point something? I know that number's in the low 2s. That's probably pure sand, and that's verified by this organic matter percent as well. I've learned through experience, if I've got an organic matter percentage below a 1% level, it's going to be a roller coaster ride for me, managing water, managing nutrients, because there is no holding capacity there. So the other thing that can be problematic in these soils, which we don't have a lot of in lawn care, but certainly sports turf does, is our lab numbers bottom out on magnesium and potassium at 200. So when you've got very little holding capacity, those numbers will more than likely be below that level, regardless of what's going on in the soil. You know, in this case, potassium, we need 167 pounds to make up for the deficit. We're not going to get there. We can't afford to get there. We shouldn't afford to get there. But it's something that we want to incorporate into our plan and our program. We want to just make sure that the plant's getting enough potassium on a regular basis. So hopefully that kind of beats that dead horse. So in the case of a really, really light sandy soil, that's where a soluble paste extract test might be very valuable for us, because we can look at the difference between the two. In a standard soil test, I probably should have had this in here. What the lab will do is they'll take that sample and they use a very weak acid extraction method to extract the mineral off of that soil colloid, and they measure that. And how that came about, it's a long, involved story, but it came about from trying to mimic what root acids do to mine soil nutrients. They're very, very weak acids that are exuded from plant roots, and they go out and they make things available, and then the plant roots will take them up. So that's where that came from. And in the case of a paste extract, it simply takes either your irrigation water, or I would prefer the lab used deionized water, and they flush that sample and measure the rinsate. So what that's doing is it's telling us what we're getting every irrigation, what's going to be available to the plant on a more snapshot type of basis. There's some things on some parameters on the standard soil that aren't available on the paste extract, and vice versa. We use these a lot in light soils because it helps to build it helps to build the fertility program for golf course superintendents specifically, and sports turf managers, because they're managing something that is basically a spoon-fed sort of system. But we can also tell this is really valuable for things like bicarbonates and salt levels in the soil, because it gives us a really good picture of what's going on. We do not have a bicarbonate test on the standard soil. So if that's something that you're interested in, we'll have to go that next step and look at that. Look at this test in particular. It's a little bit different look, and there's a few things that are different about it. Again, we show bicarbonates on this sample. It shows very clearly what the mobility of the cations are. The balances are different, and the other thing I use this a lot for is looking at traces. If we've got a pretty well-functioning soil, but things just don't look right, a lot of times the paste extract, especially in higher pH levels, the paste extract will look very different from the standard soil because of the extraction method. You know, and one of the things that we look at a lot is, I mentioned it earlier, if we've got high pH, a lot of times things like phosphorus, things like micronutrients will not show up very well. And that bears out in the case of a paste extract test. Even using deionized water, it'll show limited mobility in that case. So that's something that we like to account for. And again, I've got this is a sample of our guideline sheet for the paste extract test. We've got a similar format for all three of them, and that's available on our website. I didn't want to get into that a whole lot. There are instances where that's of really high value for us, but it's not always the case in lawn care, and we can probably glean what we need to glean from the standard soil. Any questions, Almar? We good?
I think we're good. I took some liberties here. Brother Mike had asked what the CEC value is that would equate to the small, medium, and large bottles.
Right.
I said 25 plus on a large bottle, 10 to 25 on a medium bottle, and below
Perfect.
10 would be a small bottle.
Yep.
And
yeah, it might be 8 to 20, somewhere in there, okay. But yeah, below 8 is usually the small bottle. Yep. Good question.
I was in the neighborhood. And I think the one quick thing I wanted to interject here is earlier on, Kevin was talking about on one of the soils that we saw here in Colorado that the sodium was 110, and that would normally throw up red flags. If we were dealing with a small bottle, that Florida beach sand that I'm familiar with from my early career, that would be a, oh man, we got a problem.
Yep.
Because we're dealing with this huge bottle that is what we consider a big soil with a humongous high CEC. It can hold more stuff.
Yep.
To break it down super simple. So
great way to put
reasons that with the base saturation percentage, it's always a percentage. That's why we use it. Whereas the parts per million can vary between low and high CEC soils by thousands of ppm.
Yep, exactly. Well put. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on water testing because I wanted to get into a couple of other concepts, but just know that we can do the testing in our lab. If you've got a big acreage client that has a questionable water source, or nobody's looked at it, might be of value. None of these tests are tremendously expensive. And in the long run, we hope to be able to save you some money just by knowing what to do and making intelligent decisions. There's a number of things that we look at. Again, if you haven't figured out the theme, the pH is probably the last thing I look at on a water test as well as a soil test, because again, it's a result of some of the other things that are in water. I feel the weakest on water, but I've gotten a lot better on reading water tests in the last year, thanks to a couple of my mentors really walking me through it. So I can help fumble through this with you pretty well at this point. On the low CEC soils, one of the best ways to make those corrections is to invest in carbon. And this is a golf green, but they're investing in some carbon during the aerification process. It's a really good time to get to start to build a little bit of a base. We'll get into a little bit of product, but hopefully I'll tie this back to what we just looked at in the soil tests and why. Get into maybe a little bit more of the why we do what we do with respect to fertility selections. This is what we call our family portrait. What we do is base everything on biological soil management. And if you think about this as a stool, there's a three-legged stool here. This is the soil system. We talked about the chemical now, which can affect physical properties in the soil as well, based on the chemistry balance. But we also have a biological leg of the stool that's really, really important. That's what we feel as though we bring to the table with a lot of value is boosting biology, not only to help us make the most of our inputs, but also to get a soil that's functioning properly so that you've got healthy turf as well. And that balance is between carbon and nitrogen, but it's also, we balance the soil test with carbon inputs so that we can, again, reduce some inputs and hopefully make it a more stable system. I think this kind of goes without saying, the soil systems approach. So looking at carbon to nitrogen ratio, I always get the question, well, what's the right number? The right number in a lot of textbooks is 20-1. That could be the case for a soil or a fertility product. Don't get too bogged down on that. I see one of you writing notes. Don't write notes on that. That's not that important. But know that in your part of the world, your carbon to nitrogen ratios are probably quite a bit off. And as long as we can get a little bit in the system and in the program, your soils will start to work a lot better. Biology is important. If any of you sat through any soils classes, this is called the nitrogen cycle. And this does not happen, period. Nobody's figured out a way to make an end run around this process. Nitrogen has to break down into nitrate for the plant to be able to utilize it. And that happens through biological reactions, through biological digestion. And what we're doing with carbon inputs is trying to create an environment that biology can thrive in. We're doing a lot of things in soils to make life really tough for biological activity. I'm going to skip that one, and maybe I'll do this real quick. So as far as the carbon-based inputs, there's a lot of different things to choose from. The sludges are okay for bulking agents. They've typically been pasteurized, which means they're biologically inactive. They tend to be a lot cheaper because usually the wastewater treatment plant's trying to get rid of them. There is some value to them. I don't want to dispel the value, but the meal-based products, there's a lot of those out there. The advantage is they're naturally higher levels in N, which makes them a little more valuable, especially in lawn care. But there's no mineral and no digestion that's taking place in those products. So that's something that the soil system will have to do to get you to the value of something else. Pasteurized materials are great. Some of the manures are really great. But again, if we're looking for biological load, pasteurization is heating. And once you heat something, you pasteurize it so that you can get all the pathogens and things out of there. So you've taken a lot of the good guys out. Lastly, compost. We fall into that category. Our products are composted for between 6 and 12 months, depending on time of year, moisture levels, that kind of thing. I can tell you that you don't want to be in the back of that house, but by the time it gets to the front, it's somewhat tolerable. We base everything we have in our granular line on egg layer poultry manure. And the reason we do that is it's typically higher in calcium and is a very good carbon and nitrogen balance because we don't use bedding material in that process. And that can throw off the carbon and nitrogen ratio as well. So we try to use that. Well, we do use that as our sole source of input on that side. And again, we're trying to build soil biology, trying to do what we can so that they can start working for us. These are just some of the things that benefit from carbon inputs. I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing that I'm moving a little too slowly here. We've got a number of, like I said, we've got a number of OMRI listed products, as well as some bridge products. Mark and I have been focusing pretty heavily on this 822 product, as well as the 1605. 822 is about 1,200 pounds, 1,400 pounds of compost, and then the balance of a ton is ammonium sulfate. So again, going back to what we talked about in calcareous soils, if we're constantly working some of that calcium off that soil colloid, you're going to get a very nice extended response out of a product like that. 1605 is for the guys that are kind of trying to transition maybe to a more organic or natural based approach, but they want to try to get to that end value that maybe we had in a synthetic blend. It's been a pretty good performer. We've had to, because of the zero phos, we had to take some of the compost out, and we've added a dry humate to that product, which we found out is actually quite beneficial with respect to leaching. So that might be a product to talk about, and we're getting some feedback from Mark's customers now that started using it this year, and our timing was off because of the weather, but we'll definitely have some more feedback on that. 822 has been in their warehouse for a couple of years now, and I think that's for this industry has been a very, very good performer and an easy conversation. Typically, even though I only recommend a half a pound of nitrogen per app, some guys will nudge it up to 3/4 of a pound. But typically, even with the 822, we'll see 8 to 10 weeks out of that product, especially with repeated use. Because again, we're building soil reserves that you may not have had with a synthetic blend, and so that soil biology tends to work a little bit longer than just a conventional fertilizer. I'm going to skip this one. All of these tech sheets that you see are available on our website. If they're not, I can get them to you. Some of this stuff we've had to take off of the website because of the dreaded left coast regulators, but I've got it all available. So we can get into more detail if you've got questions about that. This is kind of the newest one that Mark found on our website. And you say, hey, what about that 1605 product? It's a decent fit. It really is. And we found, I've got a golf course manager in the Bay Area that's, he's actually part of the Corps of Engineers property right below the Golden Gate Bridge, that they do a lot of monitoring because they're a government agency of monitoring wells on the property. And this has been the only input change in the last couple of years. And they've never been able to find, they've always found some nitrogen moving through that system. And this is the first product that they've been able to use and not seen anything get through those monitoring wells. So that's a huge feather in our cap, I think. I heard my whistle. Quickly, Renovate and Myco Replenish. Those are two construction type products. I wanted to talk about that. If you're doing installs on sod, one of the things that I always required my staff to include were these two products, and I'll do a little bit of detail on both of those. But basically, if you've got 10 pounds of each of those down before you lay the sod, or hydroseed, we can put both of those in a hydroseeder and blow it out that way, or under seeding, before seeding. All of these work to really help with not only establishment but long-term benefit, where you can really see a lot of stability in that soil system just from that relatively small input. The reason this works well, and I think one of the reasons this has been a really good product for the landscape industry, is we have both endo and ecto mycorrhizae in this product. There used to be a company that we actually manufactured for that had two different bags. If you were doing landscape and ornamentals, you had to have one. If you were doing turf, you had to have the other, and we'd always get them mixed up. And so we ended up combining the two into one. So if you're doing a landscape install and you've got 10,000 feet of sod and you've got $1,000 worth of plant materials going in, you can use the same product. But we've seen it in nursery stock establishment, and losses in particular establishment has sped up quite a bit, and losses have been reduced significantly. So for all of you guys that are dealing with tight margins, and once you leave that property, you know that a lot of the inputs are out of your hands. If we can do anything to try to improve the survivability of that plant material, I think it's worth it. Real simple, just throw a handful in a hole before you drop the plant in. Again, on turf, 10 pounds per 1,000 prior to sodding or seeding is really as easy as it gets. That's a difference. On the left is a mycorrhizae treated pot. So you've not only got a lot more density on top, but certainly an improved root mass as well. Renovate Plus is a cool product that we built for the construction, specifically for construction. Half of it is a zeolite material, Ecolite, and that helps with moisture retention. It also helps a lot if you've got a customer with fairy ring issues or something along those lines. There's some really good research out of my alma mater, actually, that talks about fairy ring recovery, and I think it's because of the moisture management benefit of this product. But there's a lot to be said for trying to get that sod established as quickly as possible, especially in the conditions we've seen this summer. This was a city park in Tucson, Arizona, actually, city of Marana, and he wasn't willing to do the whole park, but he did this little section here with Renovate Plus at 10 pounds, and this was sodded the same day. So his establishment, there was no other input but that changed. His establishment happened really quickly, which was a nice, and this guy he bought a truckload of it recently because he's doing so many soccer field installs, and he says, man, after seeing a couple of the results, he doesn't plan anything without it. This is another thing that I think is going to be really, really important in the future in the West is trying to figure out how to become more efficient with water. And for every increase of 1% of carbon-based organic matter, we can hold 18,000 gallons of water per acre. That's a big deal. And if we can build good humified carbon or good humified organic matter in the soil through this type of system, we can really make for a very beneficial long-term improvement in the soil. Dormant feeding in your climate might be something that we want to look at. 822 fits that really well. Once we kind of go dormant in the fall, putting that down gets things greened up a lot quicker in the spring. And as long as things have kind of slowed down, we typically do not see any kind of flush in the fall from 822. A lot of folks will use 1025 as well, but there's a number of ways to look at that. But if you've got a really demanding client that wants it green first thing in the spring, if you're not doing a dormant app, it might be something to look at with them. This is why, I'll wrap it up here pretty quickly, but this is why I think it's important to look a little bit differently, and I think we're all feeling this right now. But I mentioned Chemlon, and in '68, that's when they developed their system. Gas was 34 cents a gallon. So we're 10x that right now. Minimum wage was $1.60. We're 10x that right now. And the whole thing revolved around Mrs. Jones seeing us on a very regular basis. So one of the paradigm shifts for lawn care operators that we've had a lot of conversations about is trying to get to where, if we can reduce the number of trips, but get the same result. In other words, get them on a contract type of basis, get them the result they're expecting without as many trips, less rolling stock going out the door, fewer hours in labor. To me, it's a real win once we kind of get over the hump. And it's usually year 2 of a changeover that we really start to see the benefits of inputs from carbon. And again, the healthy soil is really what we're shooting for. I'm gonna Mark, if you give me 2 more minutes, I'll just blow through these liquids. We do have a full liquid line as well, and this is the most important slide that I think I've got to talk about. Is there's a ton of competition out there, but again, going back to Jerry Brunetti and the brilliance of some of his formulations, he really believed in a shotgun approach to building products, and linear was not in his vocabulary at all. So you can see some of the things that go into every one of our liquid products. Worm casting tea, desalinated seawater. So we strip the sodium out so we can get all of the trace elements. Fish and kelp meal, molasses, humic acids. There's a number of things, and everything that we do on the liquid side starts with that formulation. Anything we do can be used either in lawn care or in turf, ornamentals, Definitely very, very versatile in their application. This is the one that I probably sell more of than anything into lawn care and tree care. And I would encourage you to look up some of our podcasts as well. We had a gentleman by the name of Bobby Solar come on, who's a big tree care guy in the East Coast, and he's a little out there, but he uses this in everything he does in foliar and drench applications. Biggest selling product in golf course management as well as C3. So this is kind of the base of what we do. It's a great soil amendment, works really well with all of your soluble fertilizers. In the tree care ornamental side, 1 to 2% solution is kind of what we try to focus on as a routine drench. I've had guys that go up to 5% in a kind of a rescue sort of thing, but in turf, a gallon per acre per month is a recommendation. So it's really cost effective as well. But that solution based notion might work really well on the hose end type sprayers. Works really well on annuals as well. That was 4 days apart. I had to call BS on him at first, but he actually took me out and showed me, and that was pretty amazing result from 4 days. I'm gonna just bump through this. So that's in a nutshell. Like I said, that's a lot longer presentation. I do want to take some time for questions if we've got them, but hopefully that kind of gives an overview of some of the soil testing. If you've got a soil test, as I said at the beginning, if you've got a soil test that you're stumped on, and Mark's learned a ton. He's been reading books that I don't expect hardly anybody to read, and so he's a great resource to you who's right in your backyard. I'm out fairly frequently to visit, so if there's something that I can help with, either over the phone or a Zoom call, we can certainly do that as well. But I want to be a resource for you. I'm certainly trying to be a resource for Mark and his team in the Denver office, but there's my contact info.
Kevin, thank you so much. You are amazing. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to our group today. That was fantastic. I loved how much information was in the chat box. That usually doesn't happen on a webinar like this. So the chat was very active. I even commented to Mark at some point during the presentation that it was an incredibly active chat, which was that means it was engaging and great. I know that's one thing that we were talking about before the presentation began was, it's hard to do a presentation to a computer because you can't read your audience, right? So thank you all for being here. I appreciate you. You have Kevin's contact information. You have my contact information, you have Mark's contact information. And we appreciate you taking the time to be here. Mark, do you have anything as we wrap up?
No, we didn't. There was a couple of questions we didn't get to. Can you throw Kevin's contact back up there? There was just a couple, and I can get with Kevin. If you guys have my contact information, I'm on LinkedIn, all my contacts on there. Let's just take a quick screenshot, everybody, if you want to. Kevin's email there, Kevin@soil, is it soil or soils first?
Soil first.
Soilfirst.com. Okay.
Yep.
And I'll get with Kevin. I'll send him these questions. You can follow up with Kevin. You can follow up with me, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.